Hello, everyone. So thank you for having me. Thank you, Eltsline and the Sowerby Foundation for allowing me to speak here. My name is Arjun. I'm a part-time intensive care physician, and I'm doing my PhD here in philosophy with David Papner, recently with Eltsline as well. And this is some of the work that I've just started working on. So the talk is called Mummy, Where Do Babies Come From? It's a very misleading title, but we can get straight into it, maybe. So in a recent paper by Suki Finn on the methodology for the metaphysics of pregnancy, the first sentence is, one of the central questions in the metaphysics of pregnancy is this: is the fetus part of the mother? Now, in this talk, I'm not going to argue with or for the Eltsline's part view or the fetal containment view. All I'm going to argue is that this statement is wrong. I'm not going to argue that the question, is the fetus a part of the mother, isn't an interesting question, or that it's irrelevant to metaphysics. I'm just going to argue that insofar as we do metaphysics to, at some point, tackle questions about the ethics and biology of pregnancy, this is pretty irrelevant. So the outline, so I'm first going to talk through some terms so that we're all on the same page. I take it that Eltsline is the main author on this subject. So I'm going to basically just use the terminology that she uses in her previous work and then work from there. I'm then going to argue that rather than the part whole view or the fetal containment view, the main issue here is the fetus and maternal organism a biological individual or not? That's the real central question. And that actually very little, if anything, follows from whether or not the fetus is a part of the maternal organism. And if that's true, I'm just going to have a look at two of Eltsline's papers, one in 2018 and 2019, where the bulk of the theoretical work that she did happened, to just kind of see what she was up to, if in fact this question doesn't have any follow-on. And a disclaimer, I think that those two papers are really interesting and there is a lot of content. And I think that what I would like to conclude with is that while Eltsline argues a lot for the part view, what she actually is arguing about is biological individuality. And so if we reinterpret her work as being essentially about biological individuality, then that's where all the action actually happens. So terminology. So the gravida is here the pregnant organism. Eltsline is very clear that she wants it to apply to all mammalian pregnancies, but it's actually much easier if we just think about human pregnancies. So this is a gravida. The foster is anything that the gravida is pregnant with. So that's everything from the newly fertilized zygote all the way until the about to be born fetus. This is a foster. It doesn't just include this baby or this foster that looks like a baby. It also includes all of the contents that come from the zygote. So it includes the umbilical cord, the placenta, the amniotic fluid, the amniotic sac, all of it. We just use one simple term, foster. Now, I'm also going to use the term organism, and I do tend to use the term organism and biological individual interchangeably, which is a controversial thing to do because in the wider literature around biological individuality, some individuals in the evolutionary context, like eusocial insect colonies, might be biological individuals, but they're made up of multiple organisms. I don't think that that's problematic here. If the foster is a biological individual, then it's an organism. And as a rough working definition, I'm saying that an organism, a biological living system that functions as an individual entity. And I highlight the word individual because that's what I think matters. So a brief kind of talk on Myriology, which is the metaphysical study of part-whole relations and how that kind of plays out in pregnancy. But essentially, to start with, if I just give you this claim, B is a proper part. And I say proper part because in Myriology, a part is a conventional part which includes the whole, whereas a proper part is a part which does not include the whole. And when I use the word part here, I'm using it in the conventional sense. So if I say B is a proper part and I don't tell you anything else, then actually very little follows. Right? You can maybe say B is not a whole, but that's only in those cases where wholes cannot themselves be parts. So if we take the Eiffel Tower, we can say that this iron girder is a part of the Eiffel Tower, but that doesn't mean that this Eiffel girder is not a whole girder, right? So you can say that this grain of rice is a part of this pile of rice, but that doesn't mean that this grain of rice is not a whole grain of rice. So actually, if you don't first establish what a whole is or what counts as a whole, from this claim B is a proper part, probably nothing follows other than B is a proper part. If I then say B is a proper part of A, you can now make some Myriological claims about A and B, about their relationship, about its transitivity, reflexivity, etc. But really very little else follows because I haven't introduced any new wholes or any new individual entities. If I then say, if B is a part of A and A is a biological individual, now stuff gets interesting. So we could then maybe say A possesses B, right? My kidneys are a part of me, therefore I possess my kidneys in virtue of them being a part of me, maybe. If B is a part of A and A is an individual and B is an individual, well, now then maybe A possesses B only if one individual can possess another. So I'm not arguing that part-whole relationships don't come into it or not germane to this kind of argument. I'm just arguing that that's not where all of the action is. All of the action is in determining who the individuals are, what can and cannot be done to them, and without establishing what an individual is or what a whole is, we can't really talk about parts at all. Now, parts and wholes do play a part in the ethics of pregnancy, right? But I would argue that only because individuality is a prerequisite to the possession of rights. The reason it is unethical and unlawful to remove my kidneys without my consent is not because my kidneys, have a right to freedom. It's because they are mine. I possess them, perhaps in virtue of them being part of me, and I have rights. That's why you can't have them unless I say so. So parthood relates to possession, but actually parthood is not necessary for possession. I can possess lots of things which are uncontroversially not part of me. And it may not even be a sufficient condition for possession because there may be something that is a part of me, which is also an individual and has rights itself, right? That's still a possibility that we can't exclude. So let's replace B and A with foster and gravida. And we say the foster is a part, right? From that, we can then perhaps say the foster cannot have rights, but only if it is not an individual and an individuality is a prerequisite for the possession of rights. If I then tell you that the foster is a part of the gravida, but I don't tell you what the gravida is, then various Myriological claims can be made, but actually something else follows. I haven't introduced any new claims about individuality. If the foster is part of the gravida and the gravida is a biological individual, that's when it becomes interesting. The gravida then possesses the foster, but only if the foster is not an individual, and also if one individual can possess another. The gravida has rights and the foster does not, only if the foster is not an individual. If the foster is a part of the gravida and the gravida is an individual and the foster is an individual, then we can maybe say then the gravida possesses the foster only if one individual can possess another. The foster has rights and the gravida has rights, and we need to somehow negotiate these rights. But we need to establish a concept of individuality and what that entails before we can talk about parts of individuals. So I'm going to have a look at Kingma's first paper, which was on an account provided by Smith and Brogard in 2003 called 16 Days. And in that paper, Smith and Brogard laid down a set of conditions for being a human being, and they determined when in the course of normal fetal development these conditions are first satisfied. Now, the title of that paper is called 16 Days, so spoiler. Smith and Brogard's argument, very, very roughly, is that organisms are substances, and I'll tell you what substances are in a minute, and they are also isolated causal systems. Substances or organisms meet certain criteria, and I'll tell you what Smith and Brogard's criteria are. And the foster only meets these criteria at 16 days. Therefore, the human being comes into existence at 16 days. It's a very typical kind of argument in this field. So what are substances? Substances is a kind of concept that hails back to Aristotle and Plato, but it's essentially that which confers existence, right? So there are lots of things out in the world. These things have properties. What is it that has the properties? The substance of those objects has properties. So for Ruth Millikan, who wrote a great book, which I recommend everybody read, substances are subjects over which a variety of properties are projectable. So individual objects may be substances. So if I have a diamond, don't, would be great. This diamond is a substance, but also kinds of substances, kinds of objects may also be substances. So diamond as a category is also a substance. For Aristotle, that was an individual object is a primary substance and a kind of object is a secondary substance, but that's beside the point. If an object changes with respect to its properties, it may remain the same substance. So when the Kohinoor diamond was recut, it was still the Kohinoor diamond. But if an object changes with respect to its substance, it ceases to exist. So if you burn a match to ash, there is no match. So the substance is that thing which makes that object exist and have properties. So for Smith and Brogard, substances can undergo changes. They must either stay numerically the same, the substance ceases to exist, can have spatial parts, some of which can be added, lost to change over time, standard stuff. But then they must also have a complete connected external boundary which separates it from other substances. They are internally connected and are independent entities. So whatever the case may be, these are not standard criteria for substances, but they're criteria for individualities. Smith and Brogard substances are not just substances per se, but individual substances. So Elseline Kingma in 2018 argues on Smith and Brogard's account, each substance possesses its own complete connected external boundary, which divides its interior from its exterior, and at the same time separates it spatially from other substances. Fine. Organisms are substances, uncontroversial. The foster is not physically separated from the gravida. We will have a look at that later, but we can accept that for now. Therefore, the foster cannot be a substance or an organism. If the foster is not a separate substance or an organism, it's physically attached to the gravida, the foster is part of the gravida. And there are really two parts to this argument, and I'm going to focus on the first part. because her interim conclusion, fetuses are literally lady parts, really stems from this premise, which from Smith and Brogad's account is a criteria of individuality. Now, whether we choose Aristotle or Strawson or Ruth Millikan's account of substances, what matters here is that Kingma is not arguing that whether or not fosters exist, or that they have properties, or that these properties are projectable. What she's arguing with is the criteria of individuality that form part of Smith and Brogad's account. So she's really arguing that the foster is not an individual substance, and individual substances are organisms. Organisms are and must be individual substances. That's where the argument is actually happening. So she argues this, so she's really arguing about biological individuality and whether the foster is or is not an individual. And then in that paper, she bases this account on Smith and Brogad's criteria for organism. So like I argued before, until you have a concept of an individual, you can't proceed to talk about parts. So in the first paper, Elseline starts with Smith and Brogad's account and takes that as given and then sees what happens. So in her next paper, she argues outside of that context by first giving us criteria for parthood. So she talks about homeostasis and physiological autonomy, metabolic and functional integration, topological continuity, and immunological tolerance. So a part of an organism is something that is, for example, physiologically integrated, cannot be topologically separated out, right? So one lump, one organism, two lumps, two organisms. And immune system, organisms have immune systems, anything that the immune system tolerates is part of that organism. But really, these criteria for parthood are only anti-criteria for individuality. If you don't meet the criteria for individuality, what else could you be if not a part? Well, these criteria are criteria for parthood then only if one individual cannot be part of another. If one individual can be physiologically integrated into another, then metabolic and functional integration isn't a criteria for parthood at all. Without establishing whether or not this is the case, whether or not one individual cannot be a part of another, the only way of really interpreting this kind of argument is as an argument about the biological individuality of the foster and the gravida. Is the gravida one biological individual or two individuals? Is the foster a biological individual on its own? Whether or not it's a part of the gravida is really of no relevance. So we can look at these accounts in a little bit more detail. So these are all physiological accounts. There are other accounts of biological individuality. Actually, the most prominent account is the evolutionary account. But firstly, homeostasis, autonomy, and metabolic and functional integration. So an organism is a functionally integrated unit which maintains a tightly controlled internal environment. That's fine. The foster relies on the gravida for nutrients and removal of waste product. That's uncontroversial. Therefore, the foster is not physiological or physiologically autonomous. It is not an individual, claims Kingma. The foster does not fully maintain its own internal environment. The foster is not a metabolic individual. But now, in Kingma's paper, she very explicitly says that these accounts all are problematic, and therefore we shouldn't take each account on their own. But if something meets all of these various criteria, then the chances of it being a biological individual or a part should be strong. But these accounts are actually pretty terrible, right? So if a person with kidney failure is hooked up to a dialysis machine, does that make the dialysis machine a part of them? Right? This individual is no longer able to maintain an internal environment. Does that mean they're no longer a biological individual? If two individuals are attached to the same machine, are they now one individual? right? If this is your account of biological individuality, these are bullets you're going to have to bite. So one kind of straightforward thing about the metabolic account is that it creates problems for the topological view, right? If the foster and the gravida are topologically separate, why is the foster using the maternal kidneys? So Kingma claims, well, it says, are foster spatially continuous with the rest of the gravida? Yes. No, right? So when the zygote is first fertilized, it's surrounded by a layer called the zona pellucida. The zona pellucida is a layer which prevents the implantation of the zygote in the fallopian tubes so that you don't get an ectopic pregnancy. Once it's invaded the uterine wall, right, it becomes very tightly integrated with the maternal circulation, but there remains an anatomical separation called syncytial trophoblast, which is an epithelial layer which surrounds the fetal tissue to create a barrier for things like hormones. So a lot of hormones don't cross the placenta so that it doesn't interfere with sexual maturation of the fetus. The syncytial trophoblast is supposed to prevent infections, and there's a lot of literature around what kind of infections do and do not cross. But we know that loads of things cross the placenta and loads of things don't, because they're all trafficked across a membrane. So the foster is in fact topologically distinct from the gravida. It may not be easy to separate it out with the naked eye, but if you have an electron microscope, this is what it looks like. The ST in the right-hand side is syncytial trophoblast. You don't really need to look at all of the labels. It's pretty visually obvious. So topological continuity. Of all of the accounts, of physiological accounts, I think this is probably the worst. But it tends to favor the view that the foster is a separate individual. But barriers and topological distinctions are not definitive of biological individuality at all, right? My blood cells float around freely. That doesn't make them biological individuals. There's a blood-brain barrier around my central nervous system, which traffics all sorts of things. Some things cross the blood-brain barrier, many things do not, and we know all about that. But my brain isn't a separate individual from the rest of my body, or at least we're going to just suspend that possibility. So then we have this immunological account, which is quite popular. And it's put forward by Thomas Parthood. And he says an immunological individual is a functionally integrated whole made up of heterogeneous constituents that are locally interconnected by strong biochemical interactions and controlled by systemic immune interactions. Right, so immune tolerance. The immune system is meant to define the boundaries of an individual. The immune system travels throughout a biological individual or an organism. It interacts with lots of things. Anything that it accepts becomes part of the identity of the biological individual. Anything it rejects is not. And the immune system of the gravida tolerates the foster. If it didn't, the foster would be miscarried. That's all fine. So according to Kingma and also a subsequent paper by Gross, the foster is not an individual on the immunological account. No, the foster has a separate immune system from at least 13 weeks gestation. It has its own T cells. The syncytial trophoblast is an immunological barrier. There are two immune systems here. Right? The immune system of the foster interacts with the gravida through a number of regulated processes across the placental membrane. This isn't a passive piece of the gravida which is being tolerated by its immune system. There are two immune systems that are actively talking to each other. And when this conversation goes wrong, bad things happen in pregnancy. Also, the gravida's immune system cannot enter the foster, right? Immunoglobulins might enter the foster. But insofar as I can receive a plasma transfusion or convalescent plasma from a survivor of COVID and not become a part of my donor, I don't think that that should necessarily worry us here. If the gravida's immune system enters the foster, as it sometimes does, the foster dies. if the foster's immune system enters the gravida dies, and the foster dies as well. The foster, on at least this account, is a separate immunological individual. But how do we count immune systems? Right? One thing that Prado is actually pretty light on is this particular question. How do we individuate an immune system? So in cases of autoimmune disease, right, so type 1 diabetes, where your immune system wipes out all of your Langerhans cells, should we think that that individual with type 1 diabetes is a biological individual without Langerhans cells? Right? Because their immune system seems to think so, and we don't think that they're not a biological individual. So this is actually, while it seems to, I think, support the idea that the foster is a separate immunological individual, this is not straightforward at all, and there is still definite holes in this account. So, my conclusion. I think until we have figured this out, until we have figured out what we mean by biological individual or organism in the context of pregnancy or out of the context of pregnancy, part-whole relations really is of no interest. They have no ethical consequences beyond their implications for biological individuality. So it's only in the case that a part cannot itself be a biological individual that all of these things about autonomy and stem cell research and whether or not you can experiment on a zygote come into play. Is the zygote a biological individual or not? Right? That's what we want to know. There may be all of these issues of possession and ownership, but those can be theorized on their own. We can talk about possession and ownership and what you can and cannot possess and what you can and cannot own, and talk about biological individuals, and then we're basically done. So King is actually really interested in biological individuality, and she may disagree with this because she's here, but I don't think that, I think that the part-whole relation argument is really just a vehicle or a stepping stone to this, which is the real question. What is this thing that is growing inside a pregnant organism? Should it be considered a biological individual? What kind of rights would that entail? Just because it's a biological individual doesn't mean it has rights at all, right? We don't think the germs in our gut have rights, and they are biological individuals. We don't think worms have rights. So is the foster a biological individual in the fashion of a worm or in the fashion of a human? That's the real question here. And the problem of biological individuality is not solved. There are plenty of accounts, but there are problems with all of them. And you can take lots of flawed accounts, but two wrongs don't make a right. So we need to fix our idea about this. We need to come to some kind of consensus on biological individuality before we then proceed to talk about if this is an individual, what may or may not be counted as its parts. So until we solve it, I think part-whole relations are really of no interest to ethics or biology. Thank you very much.